So in this video, we're gonna talk about atomic structure. Okay, so we're just trying to understand the the kind of the kind of get a general idea of atomic structure. Okay, so an atom basically looks kind of like the solar system, where you have a central nucleus. Okay, so that's the nucleus. Let's mark that in blue. Nucleus. This nucleus has two types of particles in it. Okay, so the two particles in it, I'll put them in green, protons and neutrons. Okay, so I'll write out here P stands for protons and N stands for neutrons. Okay, and then outside the nucleus you have the rest of the atom. So let's say that's the rest of the atom. Okay, so an analogy would be, if this was the solar system, that would be the sun, and then all the space outside the sun would be where the planets and the moons reside. Okay, so that being said, the electrons actually reside in this space. Okay, so you'll have quite a few electrons out here. So E is equal to electrons. Okay, so you have three different particles within the atom. You have the protons, neutrons, and electrons. Okay, and these collectively are known as subatomic particles. Okay, because they're within the atoms, hence subatomic particles. Okay, so these three particles out here, they're associated with, each of them is associated with a mass and a charge, and these are all relative to each other. Okay, so let's put them up here. Relative mass and charge. Okay, so the relative mass of a proton is that's 1. The relative charge of that proton is +1. Okay, the relative charge of a mass of a neutron is also 1, and the relative charge of the neutron is 0. Relative mass of an electron is 0, and the relative charge of an electron is -1. So if you look at an atom, the complete structure of the atom, you're basically going to have, for a neutral atom, you basically have the number of protons equaling the number of electrons. And why is that? That's because, you see, the charge of an electron is -1 and the charge of a proton is +1. So therefore, let's take, for example, I'll put it in blue out here. Let's take, for example, you have 10 protons. That would contribute a charge of 10 times +1, which is +10, right? And then if you have 10 electrons, that would contribute a charge of 10 times -1, which is -10. So when you add them together, +10, -10, you add them together, that gives you 0. Okay, so that 0 is basically what you would expect for a neutral atom, because all the charges cancel out each other. So that's the story of neutral atoms. Now you can have an atom that is not neutral. So an atom that is not neutral, you could have an atom which is a positive atom. If you have a positive atom, the positive atom is called a cation. So I'll write that out here, cation. Okay, and the cation has more. So we're going to say number of protons is greater than the number of electrons. And just in case you're wondering what this sign means, that sign basically means greater than. So put it out here, greater than. Okay, so there you have it. Number of protons greater than the number of electrons. You have you end up with a cation. Okay, and of course this results from the electrons being taken away. Okay, So we're going to call that loss of electrons. So when the atom loses electrons, you end up with a cation, okay? Now, how about if you had a negative atom? Well, if you had a negative atom, then simply put, the number of electrons is greater than the number of protons. And if that is the case, then what we say is electrons are gained. And this kind of a atom is called an anion, okay? And that gain of electrons, so whenever an atom gains electrons, you usually result in an anion, okay? Now, one thing to make note of is when you're talking about atoms, when in general, whenever the word atom is mentioned, an atom is always associated with a neutral atom, okay? So if someone wants to mention that the atom has a certain charge, then that atom would be called a cation. Then it's no longer an atom, actually, or an anion. Okay, so there are two types of ions. Let me just explain that out here. There are two types of ions: positively charged ions, which is a positive atom, called a cation, and then there are negatively charged ions, which is basically a negative atom or an anion. Okay, now you can go into more detail out here. You can have a whole bunch of atoms together, okay, which would basically make it a polyatomic ion, but we don't need to worry about that at this point in time. Right now, all we need to worry about is the basic structure of an atom, how the electrons and protons come together, okay, the relative charges, and that's pretty much the general structure of the atom, okay.